welcome to Medieval Monday. My name is Matthew Davis, and I'm starting this channel because I have a PhD in medieval English literature from Texas A&M University, and I am currently on the academic job market, which means that I spend an awful lot of time writing an awful lot of things about what I do. And my thought is that this will make it a little bit easier for me to actually talk to people about it in a way that doesn't come across as necessarily pedantic, but also is a way that's approachable and easily understood. Think of this as the equivalent of the elevator speech that you might give to somebody. They go, "So what do you do for a living?" "This is my elevator speech." It's going to be a little bit longer than, say, the minute or so that those usually are, however. So what I'm currently doing is I am working on a number of academic projects. I have a monograph based on my dissertation I'm currently revising that's on Mary Magdalene from the 12th through the 16th centuries. And I'm currently shaping up a couple chapters to send out for the big book proposal. I have an article on the staging practices of 15th century England, specifically the East Anglian play of the Digby Mary Magdalene, and how that how I think it could have been performed. That has been sent out to press, and they've come back to me asking me for some revisions. So I'm going to be revising it and getting it back to them probably in March. I have another piece that is completed and is sitting at a journal on the Clapton Chantry Chapel at Holy Trinity, Long Melford in England. And once I get that back from them, I'll go ahead and make whatever edits they ask me to make. That's been accepted, and it will be forthcoming in the journal Medieval Religious Cultures in January of 2017. And I have fourth project is an edited volume I'm doing with two friends, Dr. Tamsin Rose Steele and Dr. A.J. Turnotor. And what we're doing is it's a piece on digital humanities and its intersection with medieval studies. So the idea is that it's medievalists who do actual work in the Middle Ages, not primarily work in the digital humanities, but they're using digital humanities methodologies to do their work. And it's intended to be a little bit of a primer for people who are interested in this but don't necessarily know where to begin. So the reason why I'm doing this video log, and I should stop for a second to mention I also have 2 or 3 other projects that are kind of floating around that aren't necessarily gelled into a firm article or anything like that. The reason I'm doing this log is a couple weeks ago I interviewed for an academic position at the Medieval Language Association convention. In English, you interview primarily at conventions, and the big convention everybody interviews at is the Modern Language Association conference. And in that interview, I was asked to sort of justify the stakes of the work I do. And I was asked to justify the stakes and kind of theoretically. Now, I've always approached theory in sort of the way that you might approach building a bench if you're a carpenter, or tuning a car. You have a number of tools available to you, and you pick the one that best suits the particular situation you're working with. So I was a little stymied. And what I think started this conversation is I mentioned offhand that while I talk about gender quite often when I teach, I think it's an interesting subject, and obviously the Mary Magdalene play and some of the other work I do is very significantly involved with gender. I don't like to define it in terms of feminism. I don't like to use the word feminism in my teaching. Not because I have anything against feminism. I consider myself a feminist. But because there is such an amount of both cultural and theoretical baggage that comes with the term when you're trying to apply it to something that's happened 600, 700, 800 years ago. And so this kind of started a conversation where they asked me a lot about queer theory, and that's a particular subject I don't know all that much about. I've read a little bit of it, but I'm not a queer theorist in the least. If I was going to identify myself, I would probably identify myself as a historicist. And then they asked me the question if I considered myself theoretically conservative. Now this, it's sort of like if you're, the question is asking you, are you cutting edge? The notion that when you're applying for a position, you're always looking for the new thing. To be asked if you're theoretically conservative, that feels a little bit like the kiss of death. And it threw me a little bit, because I do use some postmodern theories in developing my own approach to things. I don't particularly use the one that's very common right now in my particular field, which is object-oriented ontology. But I do use actor network theory. And the reason I use actor network theory is because I'm interested in the notion that a collection of tools and ideas and people can kind of form a network which then has an action on a cultural item or an idea or a piece of writing. So what happened is we went kind of around and around on this, and it struck me that one of the things that would be very useful to do would be to start recording my thoughts on these things, and just to get both a better feel for kind of talking about my work at large to people who aren't already invested in it, and then also to answer the theory question, answer any other questions that might be out there. So what I'm primarily interested in as a historicist is context and change and the transmission of ideas over time. So the way I frame this is I think about these ideas in terms of a sign. And I like semiotics. I like Saussure semiotics, but I tend to use the semiotic of Charles Sanders Peirce. And the reason I do that is because he actually splits up in one version. He has multiple versions. In one version, he splits up the idea in kind of three forms. So you'll have the representamen, the object, and the interpretant. And what that does is that allows you to, let me pull it up. It has the representamen, the interpretant. I'm just going to pull up it is the object. As you can see, this is the very first video, so it's a little rough. I apologize for that. My hope is this is one of the reasons why I'm doing these. And what that does is it allows for the inclusion of non-linguistic objects. So Saussure, when he wrote his semiotic theory, was primarily interested in how people spoke and how people wrote in terms of language. That doesn't work particularly well if you're interested in this notion of ideas as being part of this overall network that could include tools, can include, the way something is particularly designed. It can include sounds. It can include, non-human actors. A rock falls off a cliff and smashes a statue. That is a non-human action that has an effect on a human object. Where I differ from sort of the orthodoxy as far as both object-oriented ontology and actor network theory goes, is I'm not particularly willing to give those non-human actors agency in the same way humans are. I think there still has to be a human at the center of things. And the reason I think that is, you say you have an idea in your head. When you express that idea, you write it down, you speak it, whatever. You are speaking it, you are sending it out through this sort of mediated network of objects. Of the computer you're using to write something down, the pen you're using to write it, the chisel if you're writing that sculpture, you're creating that sculpture. And what ends up happening is I come along later and I look at the piece of artwork or I read your ideas and I get most of what you're saying. But you have to remember that it's a two-way street. When I read your idea, it's being mediated through my network of influences. And when it's being mediated through my network of influences, I may take something away from it that you included but didn't consider particularly important. Or you included but it really wasn't the main focus of what you were talking about, but I think it's very important. Where that matters is then the next time I write your idea down and tell it to somebody else, my interpretation of that idea is going to emphasize different things than yours, and so forth and so on. It's going to be this constant, continual process. And so, when you think about ideas, these can be ideas, totally abstracted, or they can be kind of concretized in the notion. One of the things I did in my dissertation, I talked about the notion of Mary Magdalene as a saint, as sort of a collection of signs, sort of this free floating set of signifiers that you can kind of grab onto and pull and twist and, to suit what you need it to suit. And then that sort of telephone game is what ends up transferring ideas over time. It's what the transference of culture. So where I'm really interested in is this idea of the sign as sort of an aggregate. The term I used in my dissertation because I was feeling cute. Let's just call a spade here. The semiotic packet. You have this network of ideas, individuals, and this and that, and you're gonna have this packet that moves through the network. But really, it's sort of this aggregate of signs. And this aggregate of signs then gets interpreted in different ways by different people. And those interpretations can have implications down the road that were never intended. So where I'm interested in transmission, which they caught on to quite a bit in this interview, I'm interested in interpreting literature as part of this role of transference of ideas. And in doing so, one of the things that I think is particularly important is the ability to try to read back to the thought processes of the people who are writing it in the period. You're never going to get fully there. But one of the things I worry about quite a bit is the notion of presentism. You see it when some politician will call Daesh's practices medieval. Whereas in reality, the Middle East during the medieval period is incredibly enlightened when you compare it to Europe. But because we've kind of read this early modern and onward notion of the medieval as something different, something other that we are better than, where the Renaissance is hearkening back to Rome and Greece, and then the medieval, the Mediava, the Middle Age. That's something different. That's this aberration between this kind of progressive streak that starts out with Greece and Rome and just kind of moves forward to us today, which are the pinnacle of progress. I'm not really willing to buy that, and so I want to give the people who wrote and sculpted and painted these works their due as individuals. And where I think the conversation in the interview went off is that they were talking about queer theory as this notion of queering a text, which is reading into it, reading kind of as a disruptive thing. And I don't have a problem with that. But when you do that kind of work, I think you need to make it clear up front that's the kind of work you're doing. And it's not the kind of work I do. I'm very grounded in the material object. Assuming I figure out how to get to work, I'm going to have slides as I go throughout this that will show some chart stuff. I have a model of the chapel at Holy Trinity Long Melford that I'll talk about in a later week. But I'm very grounded in the material object. I'm trained in paleography and codicology, which is the study of scripts and books as a physical object. And I think that physicality, the notion you have this physical thing, and this physical thing has, sorry, I have to grab a book here for my prop. This physical thing is more than just the content that is contained within it. Is something that gets lost. when we start disrupting to disrupt. Disrupting something can be useful, and I know disruption is a very big, trend in our culture right now. But I think disruption should always have a goal in mind. So if I disrupt anything, I want to make sure I'm doing it in such a way that we're learning something about the people of that period, about the people who wrote these books, who expressed these ideas. And especially in teaching, because students come to you with sort of a preconceived notion of what the Middle Ages are, is quite often erroneous, and they've gotten it from video games and television, and that's fine. And that can actually be a very useful pedagogical tool to sort of read into the medieval these modern notions. But sooner or later, you need to give the folks who wrote these things their due. Otherwise, you are assuming that you sort of have a superiority over them that is solely because of your position in time. And I get really uncomfortable with that. So what I'm going to do in future episodes is I will discuss the Middle Ages more. I'll discuss the actual projects I'm working on. And I'm going to try to do one of these a week. And I would love it if you commented on this. It can be as simple as, "Oh my God, I don't believe you did this. You're an idiot." That's a fair assessment. If there's particular topics you would like to know about, and I think I can do them justice, I will. But other than that, thank you very much for entertaining the notion of listening to me, and welcome. Have a good day.